Off-season news continues to churn out of the NHL rumor mill. So Steele and I are here on the Wednesday episode of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast to break it all down for you, including some Canadian teams taking a look at Carter Hart, Jonathan Toews, what's his fantasy value, and Ivan the Beast Barbashev looking for the bag, baby. Let's get right to it on today's episode.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We're a long, long way from seeing the puck drop again on the NHL ice surface, but that doesn't mean that the NHL newsreel will not continue to churn. And on today's episode, my friends, we're going to get to everything that you need to know from around the NHL. So thank you for tuning in for the Wednesday episode. And thank you for making us your first listen every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. It's brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Steele, you know I like that little preamble, get started to get started. But we got to get into all the news that continues to roll because as we said yesterday, from now until July 1st and even July 2nd and 3rd, it's going to be spicy. And if you're a fantasy GM that cares about your team, being up on this news now will be meaning big things for your squad, I think, come September. So we got to get to the Canadian poachers, Edmonton, Toronto, and Ottawa, looking for a number one goaltender. Where is Carter Hart going to fit best? What will it mean for his fantasy value, Steele? I'm excited for your takes on this. Jonathan Toews, still a player that at times looks like he could maybe fit a fourth-line role perfectly, Steele. Maybe he's worth a look in banger keeper leagues. And finally, Ivan the Beast Barbashev, who did go beast while his time with the Vegas Golden Knights. He's looking to get paid. We'll talk about that projection and maybe what it means for his value. I want to throw it over to you, though, Steele. This is now a few different NHL pundits, analysts, experts, if you will, who have linked a bunch of Canadian teams to Carter Hart. And I think they all make sense, but where do you think this guy goes? And where do you think he holds the most fantasy value? Toronto, Ottawa, or Montreal?
Well, I think he holds the most fantasy value with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Obviously, working around the cap space will be a little bit difficult from Toronto. But when you look at the team itself and where they are at this stage in their playoff careers or the careers in general, they're right there on the cusp of making a deep playoff run. They finally got past the first round for the first time in 18 seasons. So it's a long time coming, and maybe a goalie of Carter Hart's stature at his age, 24 years old, can be that difference maker. So I think the fantasy value lies there with Toronto. But like you said before we hopped on here, the Ottawa Senators might be the perfect organization for Carter Hart. Yeah. They've got a bunch of young talent up front. They've got some young talent on the blue line to help in front. And then, of course, adding some depth and veteran players to mentor those young guys is also a bonus. But Carter Hart could be a very valuable asset to the Ottawa Senators. They're changing a lot. They got their new owner who knows how to win championships. He knows the game of hockey. And that could be a move that he makes very, very soon and with a big splash in his first season as the owner.
And what better way, though, if you're really, and who knows what type of owner and Lauer in that group is going to be. But if you want to be, make an influence and make a little bit of an impact, and we know also Pierre Dorion, though, is an astute GM. I think both you and I really like what Dorion has done over the last, especially 12 to 16 months. But Carter Hart is a Sherwood Park, Alberta boy, and I'm a little bit kind of not disappointed, but kind of shocked that the Edmonton Oilers aren't on this list. I forgot also, Steele, we're going to talk about Scott Laughton, a very interesting fantasy piece. That is a valuable one. We'll get to him in a sec. I forgot about that preamble off the top. Toews, Barbashev, of course. But yeah, the Canadian teams, this is interesting, isn't it, Steele? And you have poaching here in the title, and I actually really like it because aside from them needing to really kind of grab this talent, I think Carter Hart might be reinvigorated in a new market. We've talked all about that. And for me to answer my question, long answer, really long, I think it's got to be value-wise with the Toronto Maple Leafs because I think they still are the team. Say what you will about the postseason. We're regular season. This is fantasy, right? We're talking about getting the most out of these players. So I still would say the most wins, his most fantasy points come from playing on Toronto. But I totally agree with you. Maybe the best quote unquote fit long term, if I'm Carter Hart, I might be choosing Ottawa.
Yeah, I think it's with Toronto, but again, Ottawa is a place where I think a lot of players might want to be, except for Alex DeBrincat right now, might be the only guy, which is very surprising.
Oh,
But
yeah.
what isn't
No,
surprising,
and I
actually,
agree. I just think if he chooses, if I was
yeah.
him, I might be choosing Ottawa. Less pressure, but anyway.
Oh, for sure. Less pressure in Ottawa, and it's just a great foundation of where this team is looking in the future. But what I'm not surprised about is Edmonton not being on this list. When you look at the contracts they have, especially signing
True.
Jack Campbell, he's got 5 years or 4 years
And
left
Stuart
at $5
Skinner.
million. They've got Stuart Skinner at $2.5 million for the next 2 seasons as well. And I don't think goalies have been a problem for Edmonton. But those two guys are capable enough to getting the Stanley Cup Finals. Like we've said so many times on this.
That's
on
the
this
first
pod.
time I've heard you talk
No.
Edmonton's goaltending.
Like we've said so many times on this podcast, they got to the Western Conference Finals with Mike Smith and Mikko Koskinen. So if they can get there with those two guys, they can get there with Jack Campbell and Stuart Skinner. So, and think about it. Stuart Skinner was a rookie this season. A rookie in his first playoff run, going up against some of the best teams. And I've
been trying to sell you on this the whole time.
I understand that. Look, I wasn't disagreeing with you. I was just saying he's not there yet. And he wasn't there yet. I'm not saying he can't do it next year or the next 2 seasons.
We don't need to go down that rabbit hole.
But look at Jack Campbell. I think we've seen the worst from Jack Campbell. So when you maybe get a little bit Campbell back into the mojo we saw with his 2 seasons in Toronto. Stuart Skinner has 1 year under his belt. The goalie duo can be a little bit better and maybe split some more time in the crease. So I'm not surprised Edmonton's not on this list. I am, however, very, very sorry. I'm not surprised that Scott Laughton's on this list for the Edmonton Oilers because that's what they need. They need depth players. They need some blue liners. So very like the linkage of Scott Laughton to Edmonton right now.
And I think at the end of it all, Steele, and let's get to break in a second here. We're keeping the summer episodes very short and sweet so that you get what you need in a timely fashion. Check us out every single morning. Make sure you're tuned and tapped in. But it's not a coincidence, I think, that a number of these teams keep popping up, right? Toronto, Edmonton, Ottawa, Toronto, Edmonton, Ottawa, Montreal. For a happenstance, it happens to be Canadian teams, but, they're sniffing around. They're looking to make moves. And we will talk about Toews and the connection to Edmonton. But you know what? Let's talk about Scott Laughton right after the break because he is a very interesting fantasy piece. And when he chips in with, shots this year, he gets ice time is up, hits, points, penalty minutes. A lot of people like to add and drop. We'll talk about Scott Laughton. Let's talk about the Edmonton Oilers in general and maybe another fit up the middle in Jonathan Toews. Barbashev, is he going back to Vegas? Will he get paid somewhere else? And what does he mean for your fantasy squad? Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. And Steele and I love jumping on FanDuel. And right now, it's all about baseball, baby. It's in full swing, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet to up to $1,000. That's $1K, baby, back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't hit. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and join today. You got to be betting on right now, basically, Steele, whoever is playing the Jays because they are straight doo-doo, baby. So if you're looking for some bets from Big Flip on the diamond, fade the Jays hard. And don't miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet to up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon. You can sign up. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the MLB. Major League Baseball trademarks used with permission.
And thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Don't forget, we are free and available on your favorite podcast platform, including YouTube. So make sure you hit the subscribe and the follow button. We appreciate all that support. We are a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you can find your favorite team from all 4 major sports leagues, including the NCAA. Your team every single day. And who could be on a new team next season? With Carter Hart, maybe Scott Laughton from the Philadelphia Flyers. Philly really making a splash this offseason to get things going. But Scott Laughton, like you said, very good season. Oakville native, best season yet. Goals, assists, points, all at a career high. 43 points this past season. Pretty much a career high in every single statistical category. 50 penalty minutes, 156 hits, 57 blocks, 18 and a half minutes time on ice. Like you said, 170 shots. But what really impressed me the most was he had 16 special team points. Again, the Philadelphia Flyers were the worst power play in the league, but he had 16 special team points, and 7 of them were shorthanded, 3 of them being goals. So he's a dual threat on the power play and the penalty kill. And we love those type of guys that can do that. Bo Horvat being one of them who can play on both sides of the ice.
Yes, we do.
And when I look at Scott Laughton, this guy was barely scratching the surface, potentially being drafted in a decent, or sorry, he was barely scratching the surface, but he's potentially getting to a point where he can get drafted in a decent round of fantasy leagues. And real quick before I throw it over to you, when I look at the regular season finished fantasy points, he was close to or right with these guys: Arvidsson, Hedman, Gaudreau, Kuzmenko, Stevenson. He's finishing at the same level of fantasy points as those guys. So I can see Scott Laughton's fantasy value very improving, and he's definitely a draftable player in the later rounds.
He's definitely getting there, Steele. He's just one of these guys with such a small sample size. And I know in some banger leagues, a guy who can bring those 30, 32 points with the hits and the penalty minutes, they have value. But in most formats, they don't. Now Scott Laughton is pushing himself into a position, like you just said, where you might consider even drafting him depending on where he's at and where your format is. I would just be very wary if he goes back to the Philadelphia Flyers that you don't take him too soon. And maybe even more so if he goes to a really good team and he gets even less minutes, because you know how much I love. Look, 2 seasons ago, even 3 seasons ago, 14 minutes, then almost 16 minutes, then almost 17, and now over 18. You know how much I love that stat as an indicative factor of where he's headed in terms of producing. But I think the most interesting thing is I believe he's under contract. Hold on, let me pull this up. He's under contract, Steele, for another 3 seasons. That's what's really most impressive. And $3 million for a guy who brings all of that to the table, I would love to see him, honestly, in any of the teams he's rumored at, because he brings a whole – look, Toronto, Edmonton, Ottawa, they all realistically need this guy and what he brings to the table. So let's see what happens. But I don't think Philadelphia is going to give him up for very cheap, especially giving his team-friendly contract.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And when we talk about Toronto, I know that there's been some rumors, some speculation moving around about potentially buying out TJ Brody's contract to create some cap space to facilitate maybe a trade of this stature. So that's a possibility for Toronto, maybe even a few other teams out there looking at.
Yeah, there's a lot of buyout potentials.
A lot of buyout contracts potentials this offseason. One other guy, though, let's move on to Jonathan Toews, who is not under a contract right now. 35-year-old UFA of the Chicago Blackhawks, captain for so long. I'll let you start it off with Jonathan Toews and what you think of his fantasy value, his future in the NHL as well, and what you think might happen next season.
Obviously, what this guy has done in his career, we're never going to take away or say a single bad thing about Jonathan Toews on or off the ice. He is the epitome of a leader. He's the definition of what I draw up as the hockey player that I would want to lead my team into battle every single time. Maybe not now at 35 years old, but 10 years ago, I'm probably picking him as one of the top pieces to build a franchise around. 3-time Cup winner. Conn Smythe winner. He is an all-rookie team member, a Selke winner, a Messier Trophy Award winner. He's a shoe-in Hall of Famer, Steele. And for me, the health is what it comes down to. Yeah. We know he's dealt with injuries. We know he's also dealt with very serious illness. These are some of the caveats that make it very wary for me to want to tell you that there's any real fantasy value here. So I think there's a very big kind of exclaimer here. But 15 goals and 16 assists in 31 points in 53 games, Steele, showed me that if he can be healthy and in the right situation, if it is Edmonton and he might be getting some looks on that second power play maybe, or if an injury happens, he gets some really good looks in the top 6, then he becomes a good week-to-week option. But for now, we just got to keep the eyes on, because I think actually it might be more important for the Edmonton Oilers' success. I love this as their fourth-line center.
Yeah, I completely agree with where his NHL value might lie as a fourth line or maybe even a third-line center for a different team, though. Again, you can't deny what he has accomplished throughout his career. One of the best hockey players we have seen
Yes.
over the last few decades.
Yes.
Second youngest player to ever win the Conn Smythe. He won it at 22 years old, had 28 points in 22 games, 2 gold medals in the Olympics as well.
Wow.
Voted among the 100 greatest players to ever play the game. So you can't ever take that away from him. All the accomplishments. But at the end of the day, Jonathan Toews doesn't have it anymore. There is no fantasy value to put on him. Again, 31 points in 53 games. It's not bad when you look at it, but negative 31 on the season. He had 87 shots, 23 blocks, and only 9 hits. He's never had single digits for hits. He's never been that much of a physical guy throughout his career, but he's never had single digits for hits or as low as 23 blocks. Obviously, he only played the 53 games, but you said it yourself. The injuries are a concern. The illness with chronic immune response syndrome for the last 3 years that he's been dealing with, that's a huge concern. So again, the question really is, if he goes somewhere, do the stats improve slightly? Maybe. What if he stays in Chicago another year? Do they improve if he plays a full 82? Maybe so. But again, this is a little bit of a side note, but also sort of related, because if he does stay in Chicago has $37.5 million in cap space this offseason. Everybody on the team is that's under contract is under $5 million, except for Seth Jones, who's at 9.5. They're about to draft a generational talent in Connor Bedard. So for me, I'm looking at this team. Maybe they sign Jonathan Toews to a 1-year long-term contract. But if Chicago can find their next Corey Crawford and use Bedard as bait to entice other stars around the league, they can go from the bottom to the top real fast. But
Corey Crawford,
if Jonathan Toews resigns for 1 year with Chicago and he's healthy, you never know what's possibility. But I don't think there's any fantasy value.
Yeah, I don't want to say he's the only reason why I don't want to say he's done. And you're not like out of left field with this take. There's nothing really wrong with what you're saying. It's just he's earned more respect from me. And what I did see when he was healthy on the other caveat deal, what you're saying is also what he's done on the worst team in the NHL, arguably, in Blackhawks with 31 points in that many games. I'd just be curious about what he does on the Edmonton Oilers. And I don't think he's done, but one of the last points that I would agree with what you mentioned is where you have to watch his value is you can't help but feel if he's going to a fourth line role on a good team, those minutes are going to probably go way down. Yeah. So where is he really going to get the, 31 points playing 18 minutes a game on Chicago? Maybe he gets it just by default. So I'd be concerned there. But at the end of it, it might be if he is healthy. There's a lot of ifs. If he is healthy, if he is comfortable, if it is Edmonton or one of those teams right on the Stanley Cup cusp, I'm going to be keeping my eye on him for the keeper dynasty side of things, Steele, especially as a week-to-week, or maybe something happens to one of your centermen after the draft. You pick him up in the second or third week off the waiver wire and get lucky with him over the year. I could see it maybe being that kind of angle. Let's talk about this Barbashev angle, though, right after the break.
Yeah, the only way I'm picking up Jonathan Toews if I've got 5 or 6 injuries on my team. Again, no disrespect. He's a legend of the game, but fantasy-wise, to me, there's just absolutely no value, but there might be some value with Ivan Barbashev, the beast of the Vegas Golden Knights. What a run he had in the playoffs. But thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Make sure you hit that subscribe and hit the follow button. We appreciate all the love and support you show this podcast every single day. Ivan Barbashev is also being shown some love. Vegas Golden Knights, Stanley Cup champion, having an incredible offseason, partying away with his boys over there in Vegas.
Oh, man. Yeah.
But yeah, what a beast Barbie is. 2-time Stanley Cup champion now, 18 points in 22 playoff games this year. Yep. I hope he remains in Vegas because I really like the way Cassidy has utilized him throughout the lineup.
Yeah, that and just his and this is something that at this point in the season everyone's heard before. His chemistry with Marchessault and Eichel was something that can't be denied, and it was, one of the factors that played into this team winning the cup. But I think to start this conversation off, I just want to make sure that I got this this rumor clear. And it's not very much of a rumor because it comes from Pierre Lebrun, and he doesn't really mess around with these reports. Barbashev's looking for a 5.5 to 5.75, 6 million AAV on a long-term deal. And it might be the long-term deal that really kind of trips up this Vegas Golden Knights situation, Steele, because they don't have too much to play with. And this is a broken record because most of these teams on the Stanley Cup bubble have very little cap space to work with at all. So my thing with Barbashev is, and oh man, I meant to bring this up before because our friend Michael Amato, sportsnet.ca guru, had a really good tweet about this. And I think it was basically, I'll bring it up in a sec, but the main point was he doesn't go back to Vegas. He's probably slotting in on a third line somewhere, right? He is a really good third line piece. That's just what he is. And that's not taking away from him, right? That's just where we have to, like everything that we've talked about on today's episode, Steele, because it all is in flux. That's what you have to keep an eye on. And here's the tweet from Amato, because this is where I got to get this. Barbashev's value next season is tough to read. He's great for hits. He produced well with Eichel and Marchessault, as we just discussed. But there's no guarantee he gets that top-line treatment where he potentially lands. He's a perfect middle six or even third-line role. So that's where we just have to be careful with some of these guys, Steele, that had such good off seasons, and we're not our postseasons. We're not taking away from that. But it might balloon them to a point where some GMs in your league might draft them too early. You don't want to be that guy or gal.
You definitely don't want to overreach after a playoff run like Barbashev just had. You got to look back at the last few seasons, and that's what I always go back to. I look at the stats over the last 2 years, and he had a good season with St. Louis the year prior. Career high 60 points in 81 games. Right. I think obviously coming into this past season, we knew there was going to be a little bit of a regression, splitting the time with St. Louis and Vegas. He only played 23 games for Vegas, but still finished with believe he finished with 49 points on the season, splitting between the Blues and the Vegas Golden Knights. So definitely a little bit of a regression, but he still had a very good run this past year. Again, 18 points in the playoffs, 64 hits, 11 blocks, and 32 shots.
45 regular season points.
45, my mistake. Thank you for that. 45 points in the regular season. So again, a little bit of a regression this past year, but 18 points in the playoffs, 64 hits, 11 blocks, and 32 shots while only playing 15 and a half minutes in the postseason. So he was still playing those third line minutes like he's done his entire career, but he went beast mode. So over the last 2 seasons, over 60 points, 45, and then an 18-point run in the playoff, he's earned a little bit more respect. But again, you don't want to overreach on a guy who just had this run and hasn't had the amount of opportunity he just got.
And actually, and I want your input on this too, I think 5.5 to 5.75 is right on the money for where I would have predicted. I would have maybe thrown out the 6 number for a team who really needs him. But I think, what do you think about that number just very quickly? I think that's very accurate.
I think 5.5 is the right asking price for Ivan Barbashev. Yeah. He's 27 years old. He's won 2 Stanley Cups now. Again, he's put up really solid back-to-back years. I'm going to quickly pull up Ivan Barbashev's stats right now. But
I got it right here. What do you need?
He's put up 2 solid seasons the past 2 years.
60 points in 2022, and then this past campaign, the 45 points. But he brings those peripherals, at times 160 hits a year ago, 182 this year still. So he brings it.
I don't want to compare him, or I'm going to compare him actually. Compare him to a guy like Jesper Bratt. Jesper Bratt was 4 seasons consistently putting up 35, 40 points, or 35 points for 4 years. And then the last 2 years, he's put up 70 plus points. And look at the deal he just got in New Jersey. So when you look at Ivan Barbashev, Barbashev consistently put up 20 to 25 points a year, and then jumped up to 60, and he's now at 45. I think 5.5 is a great asking price. 5.5 for 6 years.
I think Brad has a lot more offensive upside, but I agree.
No, I understand that. Different players, obviously, but I'm comparing the two in the same situations.
I feel it, brother, and I hope everyone out there is feeling it, because I am excited to talk about every single news story that breaks from here to July 1. You and I are going to have some more guests. We talk about Michael Amato. We'll have him back on, the goalie guru from Sportsnet. We'll have some rotating guests in here still over the next couple of weeks, more locked on hosts. hit us in the comments, hit us in the DMs. What do you guys want to hear? What do you need for your prep for the fantasy draft? And I know Steele especially because he did a lot better than I did. That fantasy listener league, we're going to open it up, maybe make it a little bit bigger. Steele and I have a few ideas for that. Hit us in the comments. So if you'd like to join us in a fantasy hockey league for this upcoming season, Steele, I'm hyped for tomorrow's episode. Big time Thursday episode coming up.
Big time Thursday episode and big time NHL draft 2 weeks away, taking place in Nashville. Also, the NHL awards just a few days prior to that draft in Nashville. So make sure you're keeping an eye on that. And thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Make sure you're tuning in Monday through Friday, 7 o'clock in the morning Eastern time is when you can find all of our episodes. Again, thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode with Flip and I. Have a great day, and we shall see you back here again tomorrow.
Peace.